people have heard about ChatGPT most probably. It's well, I mean, I can summarize. It's a chatbot. You write to it and it responds back, right? And it's very human-like, right? It remembers things. It kind of like it seems like it knows a lot of stuff. It passed the SAT admissions test, the GRE. It passed the bar exam and the medical examination, but does it all. So how did it get to be this way? And how is it, like, I just want to kind of like get to the point where we see it and it's not like, wow, this is just some sorcery, but it's, what is happening inside. And to start, we need to think a little bit about language generation and how language is produced. So let's do a little improvisation game. Let's say that, you have a little, I don't know, cousin or nephew, niece who asks you, okay, can you tell me a story? And you're like put on the spot completely, but you need to come up with a story right now. And so let's come up with a story, word by word, let's improvise it, and let's think about how we did it, how we got to the point where we have a story. So let's start once upon, right? So we're gonna predict the next word, and then we're gonna think about how did we even think, realize that was the next word, right? So once upon a, of course, once upon a, because it's a common phrase, right? Once upon a. And then the next word, once upon a, let's see, a time, of course, once upon a time. But wait a second. It could be something else, right? We could say once upon a midnight weary while I pondered whatever. Well, it's from The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, from this poem. We could say Once Upon a Dream from Disney's Sleeping Beauty. Or once upon any noun that starts with a consonant. Not with a vowel, of course, because we say a and we didn't say an. But how did we know this? Because, of course, we know grammar, and we know here, in this sentence, there is to be a noun here that starts with a consonant. If you choose the most common option, which is time, then, that's, of course, what we could do. But if you choose less common ones, then that's seen as more creative or as just, like going outside of the common, like maybe like riffing off of something. It's seen as kind of this creativity, right? Even though it's just kind of like picking from a list of words, the next one in the list, it's seen as creativity. But for now, we'll just pick Once Upon a Time. So we continue with our story. Once upon a time, there was an alpaca who lived on a volcano. And let's think about what would go after this. What would be the next sentence about? And we should probably do something related to the alpaca or the volcano, right? It can't just be like we just go with any topic, right? We need to reference back. And this is something that we have learned, right? Something that we know from language that usually we need to develop a little bit more about, what happens, right? So we continue. Don't worry, though. It was an extinct, and then the next word, what could be the next word? And then the next word is volcano, of course. It was an extinct volcano, not an extinct alpaca, because why? Because of logic. We know that volcano is associated with the concept of danger. We know that don't worry means negate whatever we just said, right? And then, so that means there's no danger, so it was an extinct volcano. We also know that extinct volcano is a pretty common word to go next to each other. And so on. Later on, we realized that we need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end to the story, with the exposition, conflict, rising action, and climax, falling action, and resolution of that story. How do we know that? Because that's how stories go. If we've read a lot of stories, and we know that's generally what stories are like, and that's what people enjoy from stories, right? So it's kind of like, if you think about it, a lot of these things are just things that are common, that you've seen commonly, right? That have been affected in the past. So that's why, as we're writing this story, we're deciding on making these decisions based on what was common, right? But it turns out that being good at our improvisation game requires a lot of skill. Our story was, best-selling. we got into the Improvisation World Championship, and now we need to learn more skills to become the best at the improvisation game. So we've already seen, so what does it take? We've already seen you need to know about word co-occurrences, grammar, referencing back to topics. You need to know about story arc. We need this yes and mentality of improvisation, right? We need to, whatever, like we chose a less common word. We chose once upon a dream. We need to go with it, like we need to go with full confidence, whatever it is, just branch out and then continue the story. But there's more. You need to know, you need to learn every language. You need to learn every language because, what if your text is in érase una? You need to be able to complete that, right? And to complete that, you need to know Spanish. Érase una vez. Il était une fois. You need to know French, and so on. You need to know about many topics if you want to be able to complete the next word. The powerhouse of the cell is the mitochondria, exactly. So, in order to be good at this game, you need to know a lot of things just to become good at this game. You need to know about spatial relationships. The tuba didn't fit in the luggage because it was too big. What does it refer to in the sentence? Of course, the tuba, because the tuba was too big, so it didn't fit. But what if you say it was too small? In that case, small refers to the luggage, of course. So you need to know logic, how the world works in order to be able to be good at this game. And what if you need to fill in the blank here? The following is a conversation between a human and a friendly AI chatbot. Human, hello. Chatbot, hi there. How may I help you today? Human, please write a story about an alpaca that lives on an extinct volcano. Chatbot, fill in the blank, right? So if you become the best at the improvisation game, you will be able to be a chatbot. And here is actually how ChatGPT is working. So if we have a program that can be very good at predicting the next word in a text, we can build a chatbot. And the more knowledge that an AI acquires, it will become better at this improvisation game of choosing the next word. So ChatGPT, it turns out, is just an expert at an improvisation game, and it's literally what it's doing. At each step, it's just calculating how likely is each word or part of word to come next. So let's say we have the sentence, the best thing about AI is its ability to. So ChatGPT, what it does is it computes for every word in the English language, every word in other languages and so on. It just has huge list of words. It computes how likely it is to come next. That's what it does. I'm just showing a few words here, but actually it's every word. It then chooses among these words, hopefully one of the most likely ones. It chooses the next word, and then it repeats the process until it generates an end token, at which point it says, okay, now is the turn for the human to write. And then it waits until the human writes, and then now again, if we go back, then we'll see that we then pass the whole conversation to the chatbot and tell it, please continue with your improvisation game. So how does it choose the next word? We saw that it gets a bunch of numbers, right? For each word, it scores it, how likely it is. So it was and let's say that it determines that human is very likely, animal less likely, chicken, somewhat likely, another potato, planet in Frankenstein, a little bit, almost zero likelihood. So it's how do we choose the next word, right? So how does it choose? One way you could do it is you could always choose the most likely word. That seems very reasonable. But so it's kind of it goes back to the example of the once upon a time, right? It's a trade-off of commonness and creativity. If you remember the once upon a time, once upon a dream, once upon a midnight, it turns out if you always, every single time, choose the most common word, you end up with something that is just unnaturally repetitive, boring, and literally just might repeat the same sentence over and over again. It's just gets stuck. So actually we need to kind of shift it a little bit to, let's give, the other words that are a bit less likely, let's generate them with some probability, right? Every once in a while. And that becomes, factual, but a little bit more creative, right? We can keep on going, right? We could give even more likelihood of choosing these less probability words or less common words. We can keep going until we just, basically generate each word around the same likelihood, and then it's just complete nonsense, just random words, right? So there's a trade-off there, right? Being more factual but more cliche and formulaic versus being less factual but more creative, right? So there's that trade-off. And then you're thinking, okay, great, but how did it learn how to predict the next word? You're just begging the question here, like what is actually happening? Who taught it? What was the curriculum? What's happening under the hood? So this is part 2, how ChatGPT learned. So let me do a little side note about training and prompting these AI. Okay, so training is the process by which ChatGPT, or generally any machine learning system, learn to do the task that it does. So you can just think of it as kind of like learning process, right? Like you have this machine and you need to teach it. That's called training. What it looks like in practice is just we are updating, so we're tweaking some numbers. It's very, it's computers, they're very logical. They're just tweaking numbers. And these numbers are called parameters. And we're just tweaking them to make the system better at a certain task, right? You can think of these numbers as kind of like a human brain strengthening or weakening the connections between neurons when building memories. So that's where whenever you build a memory, it actually is kind of like tweaking the how strong the synapses or the connections between neurons are. And you can basically say like, oh, each one is like a number. And so we're just tweaking those, and that is learning. That's similar to what the machines are doing. I mean, you can also think of it, if you prefer, like there's a problem with this analogy of the brain, right? It's a little bit, it comes with some baggage that, okay, what about consciousness? What about, is it alive? Like stuff like that. But to be honest, it's just like a mathematical formula. Literally, that's all it is. Like it's just doing some math on some numbers, and we just make it look like a brain, but I mean, it's not really like, alive or anything, right? So you can also think of it as just like you have a bunch of knobs in a console, and it's just tweaking them, right? It's just like literally the machine is like, okay, I'm gonna, do something. Oh, I learned something. I'm gonna tweak to improve, like my performance, right? It's just like, and it's not like it's not like 10 knobs. It's like literally, how many knobs? We're talking 175 billion knobs. It's a lot of knobs. So like these, it just has a lot of numbers that it's updating. By comparison, a human brain has about 100 trillion synaptic connections. So it's still, less the amount of numbers or parameters than the human brain has, but it's it's pretty high up there. So now we're talking about prompting and prompt engineering. How is it different than training? So again, training is the process by which you teach the machine how to perform what it's supposed to be doing, or you're training ChatGPT to do what it's supposed to be doing. But prompting, on the other hand, is when it's already trained, it already knows what it's supposed to be doing, and you just give it instructions. You just tell it, hey, please do this, and it seems like it's learning, but actually it's just using the knowledge that it already had and kind of referencing back to the conversation and the instructions that you gave. And so like that's not actually like learning anything new. So just to make it clear. And this right now we're just going to be talking about training, right? Because prompting, it's a whole other kind of like field where people are like saying how to trick, just using English, how to trick a ChatGPT into like doing, like certain things or being more effective at writing. So yeah, I guess first of all, how wasn't it trained, right? So one might think, geez, it needs to know all these languages. It needs to know like how to write a haiku. So do we need to teach it all of these things? But actually we didn't, right? We didn't teach it grammar, how to translate what a haiku is, or how to write a 5-paragraph essay. We didn't teach each individual things, which is a big contrast with what was done in the past, where these machine learning systems used to have a lot of components that were aided by humans, right? A human was like, okay, I know about linguistics and I know about grammar, so I'm going to program grammar into it and then let it learn the rest, right? But here it's just literally just feed it data and just let it learn on its own. How it was trained is basically just a lot of examples. 300 billion words it has seen to learn what it has learned. Basically, it's just getting text from books, from the internet, etc., and using them as examples, as like kind of like exercises for it to learn the improvisation game that we did at the start. For example, let's say that you have this excerpt from The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and it says, once when I was 6 years old, I saw a magnificent picture in a book called True Stories from Nature about the primeval forest. You can make some input-output examples for the machine by simply saying, okay, once, what comes later? And the answer is when. Once when, what's the answer? I, and so on. So at each time, you can come up with so many examples in this improvisation game that it learns from. And the learning process is, first, you just give it the question, right, once, and what comes after, and then it tries, right? It tells you, okay, I think these are the numbers I would assign in terms of like what are the most probable words that come later. Then you tell it the answer, basically, and it's like, oh, okay. And then it kind of like learns based on this positive or negative feedback. What that looks like, again, is just like updating the knobs or the neuron connections or whatever. If you want more details, it's using calculus to calculate the derivative and figure out in what direction it needs to move all the billions of knobs. But it's just that's how it's learning, right? This for ChatGPT, the training process finished in early 2022 for the version 3.5. And it was a very expensive kind of process. It needed a lot of computational power. So some key points about this training process. It's very cheap and easy to obtain a lot of input-output examples. Because again, we just need a text, and just a text just gives us so many examples. Compare with a translation task, right? If we wanted to train a system to translate explicitly, we would need to feed it sentences in a language and sentences in the other language, like English, French, right? And we would need to hire a translator to do all of those translations, or maybe find existing translations in the wild, right? But we couldn't come up with how many, like 300 billion translations, right? That's going to be you would need every human in the planet to kind of like do translation. I don't know. It's a lot of translation. But here in this case, just predicting the next word is something, it's very easy to get data. It's learning from real world language, not from simplified rules that humans like, right? So humans teach grammar, these simplified rules of grammar, and then it's like, oh, but you have exceptions, and then you also have to read books in order to kind of like get a gist for like what real world language looks like. Actually, if machines just follow the rules that humans have come up with, ironically, machines end up sounding more machine-like because they're just following the rules. But if they just learn the rules by themselves without these limitations from the data, then actually they sound more human-like than if they just follow the rules that humans have made. It just cares about predicting the next word. It learns grammar, etc., just as a tool to do that. And it learns based on structures and patterns that become obvious after being exposed to a lot of certain type of text, right? It just has so much exposure to so many books and so on. Just think of it as kind of like a cinephile, right? Someone who watches so many movies and realizes most movies have a similar plot. Or think about a toddler who learns to use language by listening to it a lot, in TV or the parents, and just kind of like just by exposure kind of learns the patterns of language. Or a writer who reads a lot of books in the genre he or she is interested in writing it and develops an intuition for what kind of works and what doesn't within that genre. That's kind of the stuff. Finally, after this training is done, there's a little bit of fine-tuning to make it work better. It's really good at language, but it still needs a little bit of refinement to learn how to be a useful chatbot. So what they do then is they hire, what OpenAI did was hire some people to write some sample responses of what ChatGPT, they wanted it to sound like, right? And then ChatGPT used this feedback to learn the ways of the chatbot, how to become better chatbot, right? Then again, once it had learned the general broad idea of how to be a good chatbot, they hired people again, this time to compare like different answers that ChatGPT had produced and say which one is better to score them. And then again, ChatGPT used this feedback to further refine its approaches of chatbotfulness. Now, that training, after this fine-tuning and this feedback, the training is done. And finishing touches, then kind of like, there's some hidden instructions that OpenAI gives the chatbot before you start interacting with it, saying you're supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do that, and kind of like you were trained by OpenAI and stuff like that, kind of to give it kind of to prime it. And then there's also some content moderation to filter out some of the toxic topics. And that's it. Yeah, so that's how ChatGPT works. So in summary, it predicts text one word at a time. It randomly chooses among the continuations based on likelihood, and there's a trade-off between more precise versus more creative. There's the brain analogy of kind of like the system works kind of like a brain, but it's a little bit misleading because it can bring all of these kind of like Frankenstein kind of things. So like you can also think of it as just a system that is learning by adjusting numbers, and when it thinks, it's just doing some math using those numbers. It's trained based on a lot of books and from the internet, trained directly on predicting words, and learns everything else, as a process, but as a byproduct. And it's fine-tuned with human annotation, and it has this hidden prompt and content moderation on top. I hope this was, you liked this talk, and now it's time for questions.
Thank you for that. I was just wondering, do you know, for when it's choosing the next word, so it's collecting all of its data from written text, you say, and from the internet. Does it have a value system is it just quantity, or does it actually have like certain texts are valued more and therefore might be given a little more emphasis?
Oh, I see. That's something that hasn't been specified, at least in the in the ChatGPT kind of like blog post where they announce it. But there's this, I think it might just be like equal value. There is, however, this kind of like thing called the alignment problem, like, about how to make the bot kind of like align with, like with a certain value system or like a certain, like to be more ethical and so on, right? So, and that's part of the fine-tuning process, right? That's something they try to achieve by giving it some examples and scoring the kind of like sorts of examples, and by the kind of content moderation. But yeah, I don't know if they weight kind of like examples differently like that. They might. Thank you. Oh yeah, there's a question.
Other than Q&A, what are the other ways, if you remove the chat from the ChatGPT, what are other ways to extract information from the GPT model itself? Like, if chat wasn't one of these sources, like, is it any better or alternative to chat that we can test the capabilities of the GPT model?
Could you give an example? I mean, technically anything related to text generation, for example. I mean, there's code generation is a very common kind of like thing that they're doing with, for example, GitHub Copilot. I mean, people are like generating, like also, ideas for like movies or like all sorts of things. Like you don't really need the chat, but it's useful because then you can refine it, right? You can, the good thing about the chat is you can tell it, no, this is not what I meant. I wanted to do this, or like, can you can you change it to be more in this style or stuff like that? Whereas if you just use GPT model, which is just kind of completion, then you need to kind of like just tweak your prompt, and you can't have this kind of sort of conversation. these models have existed even before ChatGPT existed, but they weren't as popular. I think the chat really adds a lot of value to that in that sense.
Sound composition is one. I don't know what type of examples you're asking about. But
sound composition, right? Music composition is something that's not chat-based, but it is a way that this generative AI is being used. Analysis, different types of analysis tools, particularly in the medical field, of course, as well. That's not chat-based, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, sorry.
Oh, no, yeah, that's a great point, actually. There's this, I mean, sure, this is a system that uses text and chat, but you can use the same kind of principles to train on music, to train on even images, right? Recognize images or generate images that we've seen like a lot with DALL-E model and kind of like Midjourney and so on. Yeah, I mean, definitely like the sky's the limit. And there's also like multimodal systems that are called, basically where you can do chat, but also show it an image and say, like, oh, what do you see here? Or can you also like, oh, can you draw something? And like you can combine all of these things. And in fact, you know, like, I mean, there's only so much you can learn, right, from the world by reading text, right? I mean, there's a lot that comes from video and from like all of this information, for example, on YouTube, or simply like living in the world, right, about spatial relationships and so on, right? And that's something that people are trying to incorporate into these models, right? So that it can take in video, it can take in audio, and it can also produce it. And that will eventually make it more like smarter, right? And understand the world better instead of just relying on just everything from text. Yeah.
Last question for Ken.
So my question is related to plugins. In the last iteration of ChatGPT 4, they've got the plugins. I've been playing with Wolfram Alpha, which is the computational plugin. It essentially gives ChatGPT a brain for math that it didn't have before. I don't fully understand how plugins, I think they're going to play a huge role in the model. How do plugins interact with a large language model in the sense of how does the information passed? I'm not technically speaking, but how does it interact with plugins that are making calls to the chat, and how does it produce those results for these plugins?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know the details, but I can guess based on what I understand about language models in general. So a plugin, for those who don't know, basically is like, let's say that you ask the chat, please compute, you know, this kind of like math equation or whatever. ChatGPT is not very good at computing, especially because it's like just passing like one pass through this kind of neural network, and it doesn't have like the ability to loop back and kind of like do this sort of computation, right? So it just kind of like does it. So it's bad at doing like math, right? And so like what people have done is basically instead of it doing math, you just say like train it so that it will tell you, here I need to do math. Like you give it like a bunch of tools that it can use, right? And when it tells you it needs to use that tool, you simply kind of like, I mean, okay, so how to explain it better? You could kind of steer the output so that it tells you could tell it, please, if you need to use this kind of calculator, then kind of you need to call it in this certain way. Like, right, kind of like these models are used to generate code, similar like that. It generates this code that will call this tool, right? Then, those are passed into the tool computes it, and then it passes it back. And then it's just kind of like a chat, right? It's just like chatting with the tool. Hey, tool, please do this. The tool does it and then sends it back. This is the result. And then it's just kind of having this conversation. The other way around can also happen where like a tool, a program, can use ChatGPT to generate things to help the user and then bring it back to the tool, right? So that's the general idea. And the thing is, remember that we don't only have the word, but we also have that list of probabilities and likelihoods, right? So we can constrain that, right? We can say, we don't care about like language. We just want to generate like this thing that looks like code, right? you can just say ignore everything that doesn't look like code and just figure out the probabilities of the things that look like code and just generate that, right? So we can pick and choose from out of that list what we generate.
All right, one more thank you for both of our speakers.